Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to my good friend and poet, John Brehm, who is the author most recently of the book Dharma Talk. Before I introduce you to John, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So again, today I am thrilled to introduce you to John Brehm. John was born and raised in Lincoln, Nebraska, and educated at the University of Nebraska and Cornell University. He's the author of 4 full-length books of poetry, including Sea of Faith, Help is on the Way, No Day at the Beach, Dharma Talk, and a chapbook, The Way Water Moves. His collection of essays, The Dharma of Poetry, was published by Wisdom Publications and is a companion to his acclaimed anthology, The Poetry of Impermanence, Mindfulness, and Joy, also from Wisdom Publications. His poems have appeared in Poetry, the Gettysburg Review, The Sun, the Southern Review, Plume, Gulf Coast, the Missouri Review, New Ohio Review, the Writer's Almanac, Poetry Daily, Verse Daily, The Best American Poetry, the Norton Introduction to Literature, and many other journals and anthologies. So, John, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Poet.
Thanks so much, Radha. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to see you again and to have this chance to talk about poetry with you. Yeah.
So, I'd love to start with a question about the book's title, Dharma Talk, which suggests to me both the seriousness of your work, but also the humor in it. How did you arrive at that title?
Yeah, well, there's an interesting sort of story about that. Initially, I wasn't sure what to call the book, and a friend had suggested In the Thick of It, which is a line from one of the poems, Metta. And so that was the title for a long time. Um, and my editor at Wisdom wasn't crazy about that title. And I thought because this is being published by a Buddhist press, that a more obviously Buddhist title would be better. And so there's a poem in the book called Dharma Talk, which I'll read later. And it felt to me like it had both the quality of pointing to a Dharma talk, which is many of you, I'm sure your listeners probably know that that is kind of the Buddhist version of a sermon, although it's much more informal than a sermon. But it's a talk given by the Dharma teacher to a gathering of meditators, and it usually happens after a period of meditation. But I also wanted the more playful quality of like Dharma talk in the sense of like shop talk or small talk. And the poems are very conversational. They're very relaxed in terms of their diction and rhythms and so on. And so the poems are talky, and I wanted to convey that as well. But I know you said that you found the title to be humorous, and I'm curious, was it that aspect of the sort of shop talk, small talk uh, implication, or yeah, I was curious what you found humorous about it.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? It's that sense that there is um, talk as something that's given, in that mode of a sermon, right?
Yeah,
Or some kind of serious life instruction that we're
yeah,
going to be given. But then also this idea that talk is just talk, right?
yeah.
And
Talk is
that, this is the central thing of poetry, right? Is sort of bridging that more natural, everyday you know, diction, modes of relating through language, and also elevating it, right, through that idea that we are conveying a necessary, maybe not bit of information, but a necessary uh, tool by which we can re-enter our lives, if you
yeah,
will.
right. And communicate on a different level than is happens in normal kind of daily conversation. The other thing that is interesting about the title, I think, is that many of the poems are about not speaking. They're about silence and emptiness. So there's a poem called Something and Nothing that begins, there's something to be said for having nothing to say. And in the poem Dharma Talk, I also play with this idea of emptiness and not speaking, the sort of via negativa, the negative way of silence and approaching uh, the sacred, let's say, by negative means, by saying what it is not, rather than making positive assertions, like the way that Tao Te Ching begins. The Tao that can be named is not the true Tao. So there's that dimension to the title as well. So, I was kind of pushed to find a better title, and I think the title that I ended up with works on a number of levels. So I'm pretty pleased with that. And titles are hard, you know. It's hard to get one that feels just right and that has some appeal. Yeah.
So to go back maybe just slightly to what you said about having a working title, can you say more about the purpose of that working title or what that working title gave to you in the process? And then at what
Mm.
point did you know that you had the right title? I mean, was that very late in the process? Yeah, when did that happen for you?
Yeah, it was pretty late in the process. I mean, I had submitted the book to the press, and they had accepted it and were excited about it, but not about the title. When I suggested Dharma Talk, they all went nuts. They just loved it. They thought it was perfect. In fact, I think the publicist or the marketing person wanted to take credit for the title. She wanted to claim that she had thought of it. Um, the working title, In the Thick of It, it's from the poem Meta. And I remember when my last book was published, No Day at the Beach, uh, a friend of mine who blurbed it, Fred Muratori, in the blurb, he said that the poems were, he mentioned the compassionate nature of the poems, that the poems were, strongly, I can't remember how he worded it, but they were strongly compassionate, and that was a kind of foreground feature of the work. And I remember thinking, well, is that really true? I'm not so sure. And so I wrote the poem Meta partly to express this kind of empathic resonance and a compassionate way of witnessing the suffering of others. And In the Thick of It comes from that poem. And so I was kind of wanting to point to that quality of being in the thick of suffering, in the thick of the messiness of life, the difficulties, the challenges, and the compassionate response. Um, I don't know that it really helped me. I mean, I had the idea of a more Dharma oriented book because Wisdom is a Buddhist publisher. I mean, they're not like Shambhala where they do some Buddhist books and then some kind of non-Buddhist general interest or spiritual books, but um, Wisdom is a strictly Buddhist press. And so I knew that that would be an organizing principle, that all these poems. So when I imagined an audience, I imagined primarily other people, other Buddhist practitioners or meditators, or at least people who were interested and drawn to the spiritual dimension of poetry from a primarily Buddhist perspective. So that helped me to see, which poems support that, are aligned with that view, and which poems aren't. Um, so that was helpful just to have that orientation in mind as I was, writing the poems, but also more to the point when I was organizing the book and deciding what to include and what to leave out. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Great. Um, so it feels like it might be a great time to hear one or both of those poems. So Meta you mentioned, and maybe Dharma Talk as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So Dharma Talk is the shorter of the two. So I'll read that first. Dharma Talk. He said, oh, and I should say that this is based on a talk from a Dharma teacher in Boulder when I lived in Boulder, Peter Williams, he said the first line of the poem. He said, "Changing nothing changes everything." And so that's where the poem kind of takes off from. Dharma Talk. He said, "Changing nothing changes everything," which, if you change the words around, also suggests that changing everything changes nothing, which further implies that nothing and everything are interchangeable, are in fact the same thing or the same non-thing, having no fixed, unchanging nature, or a nature that is in constant change, if change can be said to be constant, and is therefore a kind of emptiness about which it is better to speak only in the negative of what it is not, or not to speak at all. And do you want me to go ahead and read Meta now, or do you want to,
Yeah, I
talk?
think it'd be nice to hear, so maybe for the benefit of folks who aren't looking at these on the page, Dharma Talk is as you can hear, a very, um, maybe a bit more pointed, concise. It's written in couplets,
Yeah.
and what you're about to hear in Meta is a bit more, as you're saying, conversational, bit more narrative, and really, well, I don't want to say too
Yeah.
much before we hear
Yeah.
it. So,
Yeah, but many of the poems in the book are quite short, much shorter than Dharma Talk even. I
mhm.
mean, there's Ku, and then there's other very, very short poems. And then there's a few longer poems like Meta. So that gives you a sense of the range of lengths that have been in the book. And Metta is spelled Metta. And Metta is a Buddhist practice, primarily a Tibetan Buddhist practice of generating goodwill towards others. It's a kind of prayer where you're wishing for the happiness, the safety, the well-being of other beings. Metta. The book I'm reading suggests we send loving kindness to everyone we see, silently addressing them thus: "May you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy." And I do this for a while, sitting inside a cafe, watching the foot traffic go by. It feels good, generous, loving, kind. But after a time, I start modifying the blessing. May you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy. And maybe also lose the frowning into the phone facial expression I get so tired of seeing everywhere I go. It's the shadow side of loving kindness, sticking its nose in, having its say, and I can't seem to shut it up. Someone else walks by and I offer, "May you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy." And while you're at it, how about some nicer clothes? It wouldn't kill you to dress with a bit more panache, would it? I keep on in this way, dishing out blessings with a side of helpful advice, until I notice across the room two young women sitting side by side, talking quietly, in no need of either my good wishes or my corrective commentary. But then I see that one of them is crying, nodding her head when her friend says something, wiping tears from her cheeks with the palms of her hands. She pulls it together for a while, but then her face clenches and she gives in until her friend lays a hand on her shoulder and she can talk again. A gentle rhythm of crying and talking, waves rising and falling. It doesn't look like she's been visited by tragedy, a sudden death or shattering diagnosis. Ordinary heartbreak would be my guess, the shock of betrayal, some painful reversal in the endless cycle of loss and gain. And now a new emptiness spreads out before her, and she doesn't know what to do. But what kills me is when she tucks her hair behind her ear and tries not to cry, and fails, overcome by the sadness, so that I feel it too. A great swell lifts and carries me and almost pulls me under. And then I'm in the thick of it, wishing her to be well, to be safe, to be happy, as if my life depended on
Mm. I just so admire your ability to, take us into the mind of the speaker, right? The poet, yourself in this case, I'm assuming,
Yes.
and to, be honest about what's going on there, and also, you know, then eventually to bring us to this moment of, real connection with
Yeah.
the world. And again, it seems like the central task of poetry to reconnect us to these moments where there is that connectedness. Um,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the themes of this book because I think this will be very interesting for people to hear about. So, the book centers on, as we've already talked a little bit about, some of the Buddhist concepts of, compassion. We just heard a little bit about emptiness, non-separation, and so forth, as well as, very universal themes like aging.
Yeah.
I'm curious, were you deliberate about working toward those themes and ideas, or did they emerge in the process of writing the individual poems?
Yeah, I never sit down to write with a theme in mind. It's more an experience like this one, or an idea like Dharma Talk, the playing with the concepts there. A line will come to me and take me in a certain direction. So I don't write with a theme in mind, but I'm reading and practicing. And so these themes of compassion, of emptiness, of non-separation, loving kindness, aging, I mean, those are things that I feel are running through my life.
Mhm.
And so if I'm writing about my life, I'm writing about those things because those are the things that I'm thinking about and trying to practice with and that are most foreground in my day-to-day experience. So it's deliberate in that larger sense of like these are the things that are sort of guiding me in my life. And of course they're going to show up in the poems that way. And then, organizing the book, I became much more aware, like, oh, emptiness occurs again and again and again. In fact, Danusia Lamaris, who wrote a blurb, the longer version didn't make it onto the jacket, but she says, think of this as a guidebook to emptiness.
Mm, mm,
And that seems, like an appropriate way to kind of one way to think about the book, but that's certainly a theme that runs through it. And
mm.
then aging, I by some measures, I'm not that old. I'm 68, and I was, younger when I wrote some of these poems. Like there's one on turning 64. It's just a 6-word poem. The slowing down is speeding up. But I have some health issues and some chronic illness. And I like to tell people that I'm 68, but I don't feel a day over 80. So aging is something that's, a big part of my experience. So I write about that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Um, so say more about this idea of a book as a guidebook, as a book of poems.
Mm.
I don't know if you talked to uh, Lamaris about what she meant by that, but it seems like an interesting way of thinking about what we might be
Yeah.
doing in creating a book of poems.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. When I got the blurb, I didn't like it. I didn't like, I thought guidebook? I thought,
Mm,
it's not a guidebook.
mm,
But I'm always that way. Almost anytime somebody writes a blurb for me, I initially don't like it. And then I come to see, oh, it's perfect.
mm,
Um, but yeah, I don't think of the book as a guidebook. I'm not sure even how to conceptualize that as a book of poems. Except insofar as, a poetry can help us live our lives. I mean, I really believe that that's true. Um, in fact, I remember there was a period, and I don't know if you remember this, but that was something that poets would often say in their blurbs for other books. This book helps me to live my life.
mm,
When I first read that, I thought, is that true? Is that really true? That seems like one of these hyperbolic things that people say they don't quite mean, when they're writing blurb for their friends. Um, but then I thought, well, if that is true, how would that be true? And I wrote this book of essays, the Dharma of Poetry, kind of based on that concept. Like, what would it mean to have poems help you live your life? And I came up with this idea that poems can be exemplary.
Mm,
The, they're not pedagogical necessarily, but they give us examples of ways of thinking, of feeling, qualities of awareness, responsiveness to life, qualities of attention that we might do well to adopt as our own. And so in that sense, I think poems can help us live our lives. And emptiness is just one of those Buddhist concepts that's really tricky. It's very hard to explain, as you probably imagine, just, but it's a very positive. It doesn't have the Western connotations of like nothingness or voidness or uh, the abyss.
mm,
Um, it's more like the Tao, which is empty itself, but the generative kind of tissue that it underlies all things. That's not the right way to say it either, but it just intrigued me to keep coming back to that and to keep thinking about the kind of negative space or what's not said or where does language drop you when it takes you to a point where the language can go no further, you know, and you know, yeah, yeah, I could say more, but it probably end up being more confusing than helpful.
mm.
Yeah.
Well, we could probably spend the rest of our time just unpacking that concept of emptiness and how it relates to poetry, because I think there is such a interesting correlation between the forms of poetry and, this, as you said, maybe having a example, something that's exemplary of that sort of allows one to inhabit a
Mhm.
a kind of way of looking at the world, I guess. I don't know, right? It gets hard to start talking about, but
Yeah.
we feel it in the poems, and I think this is why poetry is such a powerful medium, and not just to read or to listen to or to experience on the page, but also to write. So I'm curious if I could take that question a bit further. How has poetry helped you live your life?
Mm. Oh, that's a great question. But just before I get to that, I wanted to just say the other thing about poetry and emptiness is that our lives are very crowded. I mean,
Mm,
there's too muchness. There's too much of everything, and our minds are crowded. And there's a way that poetry can drop us into this spaciousness, this openness where things are not so crowded and where the mind can maybe slow down and experience a kind of calm and a spaciousness in itself that is very refreshing. And so, there's a lot of space around the short poems in my book. The book itself is quite small.
mm,
It's pretty tiny. I mean, it's physically small
mhm,
and it's not very long.
mhm.
I wanted to write a book about which no one could say, well, it's all right, but it kind of, it could be shorter. I'm just reading Kevin Young's one of his books, which is 200 pages, and he's a great
Oh,
poet. But
wow.
oh my
Wow.
God, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but how has it helped me live my life? I mean, I think it has helped me learn how to pay attention to the world, how to see things rather than just judge all the time.
Mm,
To actually stop and look and to respond to the world. I mean, the poems I love most have a kind of warmth and responsiveness to life, to daily life, to ordinary experience that finds the richness and the magic in places where we don't really expect it. So it's helped me to learn how to look and how to be in the world in a way that feels um, yeah, just more open-hearted, I think, more open-hearted and responsive and attentive. And yeah, those things are quite valuable. And, you know, my mind, like everyone's, falls back into its habitual patterns of, just relentless thinking, just the relentless proliferation of thought, most of which is just completely worthless, just loops of stuff you've thought 1,000 times before, and then just judging everything and everybody, you know. And you get some of that in the meta. You know, I'm trying to wish people to be well and safe and happy, but I'm also like, but could you do this also? You know, it's hard to let go of that. But I think, you know, great poems anyway, or good poems can help us to be more generous and kind and open. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what a powerful antidote also to other forms of media that we are exposed to daily. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I don't know if you think about that in terms of the context of our current culture.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, I don't have TikTok or Instagram or Twitter or X or whatever. I don't do any of those things. I'm barely on Facebook. So I'm not immersed in that world, but I've certainly have read a lot of people who are thinking hard about like the damage that's doing to our culture and to particularly to young people. And it's kind of horrifying. I mean, it's really scary. You know, and you go into, let's say, an airport and literally every person is on their phone. I mean, every single person has been over a phone. I mean, you know, 95% of the people are bent over their phones. And when I'm in those spaces, I try to practice like not looking and just kind of being there, looking around, and kind of taking in the environment. But um, yeah, now I can't remember exactly what you asked. What was your question?
well, it's just a sort of maybe more of an observation
Yeah.
of that, of
Oh,
the spaciousness, right? And that
as a
attentiveness and that
yeah,
invitation to live in that mode, if not all the time, then, maybe just some of the time. I think that's a very powerful gift that poetry can give to people right now.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's quite true. And I think we need those reminders that there is a different way to be in the world. There is a way to find that inner quality of calm and spaciousness that can be so refreshing because the world is so crowded with thoughts, and many of them, you know, so divisive, you know, angry and self-righteous and harshly judgmental. I mean, the public discourse is a disaster.
Mhm.
So, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, would you like to maybe read a couple poems from the book that you feel speak to this idea of attentiveness?
Sure. Let me see. Um, let me read a few of these haiku. Yeah, there are 12, there's a middle section in the book that is just 12 haiku. And like most sort of mainstream poets, I ignored haiku for a long time. I mean, contemporary haiku. I read Basho and Busan and Issa, of course, but not the contemporary haiku writers, of which there are some really terrific examples. But so these are just little observations, moments, um, not so different. Veined spring leaf and my ancient hand. Feet hurt, back hurts, head hurts, balanced at least. Coming unstitched, even the fake flowers grow old. I put my glasses on to see the fog more clearly. Scattered crocuses, as if someone had planted birdsong. Regretting something I said, I turned the lampshade to hide the scene. So I'll leave that there. And I don't know if those fit the bill of being particularly attentive. Um, this one might be a better example of that. It's a poem I wrote walking in the forest here in the Northwest. By the way, there's a very loud lawnmower. Is that coming through? You're
No,
not here.
nope,
Okay.
you're
Goodness.
perfect.
Okay, great. People love power tools around here. Um, big leaf maples. I like the way the roots of these big leaf maple trees muscle up through the ground like mountain ranges, some of them with fern moss forests on their slopes. I step over them like a god bestriding the earth. But when I crane my neck to look up, I cannot see their crowns, so high are they, and to them I must seem a needlessly complicated creature, one who walks and thinks and worries and sometimes stops to look. And now the roots look like cresting waves or ripples over creek rocks, and the path becomes a stream. I'm walking upstream, seen by the unseen.
Hmm. I love that end, seen by the unseen, right?
Yeah.
That's that moment where the speaker's beingness is being looked back at, by the world. And, this is literally true, right? There are many creatures that are taking us in as we're, and we seem to dismiss that very, very easily.
Right, because we're just
But
thinking
it's
about
a very
ourselves.
it's a very profound truth, I think,
Mhm.
for us
Mhm.
to walk through, in this case, literally walking through, but even to think about more generally as
Yeah,
a way of walking through
yeah,
life.
yeah, yeah. I was certainly thrilled when that last line came to me. It's one of those gifts, that has the right sound and an interesting idea, and it just yeah, it's sort of a perfect ending.
Mhm.
Uh, yeah, 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 yeah. But
Um,
in fact, I'm not the most observant poet in the world. I mean, I admire there are poets like Elizabeth Bishop, for example,
mm,
who has such an exquisite eye for everything, and her descriptive poetry is just transcendent. And or William Carlos Williams, or people like that, or even my teacher A.R. Emmons. I don't have that quality of perception that they have, but I aspire to that.
mhm. Since you mentioned Ammons, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about, y- you know, that potentially being a lifelong influence. Maybe it started something for you and then has developed into something
Yeah,
else along the way.
yeah.
And then along with that, are there influences that you felt were very important to this particular book? Uh,
Mm.
so I guess that's kind of two questions.
Yeah, yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, Archie A.R. Emmons, he went by Archie. He was a tremendous influence on me from the first time I read him when I was an undergrad. I somehow, when I was a senior, I got into a grad course, and the teacher loved Ammons,
Mm,
and I fell in love with his work. And then when I applied to Cornell, it was because he was there,
mm,
primarily. And yeah, he's a brilliant man and a very powerful presence. Um, and yeah, he's continued to be a huge influence on me. I think I was initially drawn to his work because of it. He was able to bring together this very particular way of seeing the natural world with a very philosophical stance, that he could deal with ideas in his work. And he seemed to be a very intellectual poet at the same time that he was really immersed in daily life. And he seemed to be able to bring those together in a way I'd never seen done before. So that was exciting for me. And then I've continued to read him, and his short poems. He has a book called The Really Short Poems of A.R. Emmons, which is really delightful. Um, and some of them are quite funny. And so he has a poem, you may know this poem, called Their Sex Life. It's just two lines, Their Sex Life. One failure on top of another. And that's very much the model for the poem I read earlier on Turning 64. The speeding up, the slowing down is speeding up.
mhm,
That kind of humor and playfulness with language and just kind of turning things around, very much an influence on this book, his short poems in general. And many of the poems in this book are in two-line couplets that are where the lines are quite short, like this, for example.
mhm.
maybe half the poems in the book are in that form. And Archie writes a lot of poems with very short lines where the kind of energy is moving down the page rather than across it, and where you're having to navigate all these line breaks. So it really keeps you on your toes and ideally in a state of alertness.
Mm.
Uh, you can't relax for a
Mhm.
moment because it won't make sense.
Mm.
So that's been a big influence on me. And then, yeah, his philosophical orientation toward the world, his not being afraid to bring ideas into poems. And I love narrative poetry and lyric poetry, but I like poets who can work with ideas um, in ways that are compelling, and I hope some of my poems do that. But yeah, he continues to be a big influence on me, and I teach him occasionally, and yeah, I love his work, and he was just a wonderful man. He's very funny and warm, and I didn't realize it at the time, but he was kind of a Taoist. You know,
Mm.
he read deeply in ancient Chinese poetry and knew Lao Tzu and Shuangzi and everybody. And I was, I myself wasn't as familiar with that work when I studied with him, but I see it now
Mhm.
deeply in his work. And I think that influence, I absorbed that, without consciously trying to, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And then, oh, you said other poets. Well, I read a lot of haiku poets for a long time, mostly in anthologies, but also individual volumes. But there's just some great work being done. John Wills, John Brandy, uh, Peggy Lyles, Edith Schiffert. I mean, there's just a ton of them, but just magical work. I'll read you a haiku that's going to be in my new anthology, which comes out in the fall, if I can do a little promotion.
Yes.
Um, the Poetry of Grief, Gratitude, and Reverence. Um, and the last poem I added to the book is a haiku by Vincent Trippi, and it goes like, um, owl feather in my palm, the feel of moonlight.
Mm.
Owl feather in my palm, the feel of moonlight. I love that.
That's
Yeah,
lovely. Yeah.
yeah. So that was a big influence on the writing of the book.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It is very interesting to hear, I think the longer I write, the more tendrils I
Yeah.
feel in very deep poetics, that Ammons is someone that most people would probably associate with a more contemporary, even experimental form. All of his use of, colons between
Right.
lines and um, on the page.
Yeah.
Uh, his work does not appear, let's put it that way, it does not appear to be drawing on those deeper sources of,
Yeah.
those ancient sources of
Right.
poetics, and
Yeah.
yet here we are talking about that connection.
Yeah.
S-
Yeah. Yeah. And he was immersed in Emerson and Whitman and Thoreau and the great American transcendentalists and Coleridge and Wordsworth. And yeah, he was a very brilliant man. He kind of read everything. Um, yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah.
So speaking of the short poems, the haiku, and this longer, more narrative mode, that you have both of those in the book.
Mhm.
Was it difficult to braid together uh, those pieces? How did you think about structuring the book, given that there were, kind of a diversity of forms you were working with?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. That I paid a lot of attention to that. I thought a lot about how to organize the book. I mean, it's almost like a long chapbook. I mean, it's what is it, 67 pages? Um, yeah. But the poems are mostly quite short. So I kind of imagine that a reader might read the whole book in a single sitting. And in fact, a number of people have written to me and said, I read it in a single sitting. And I like to joke that I wrote it in a single sitting, but of course that's not true. um, but so I wanted it to be a cohesive experience. So I made a decision early on that if I was going to include the haiku, I would have a separate section. of haiku rather than interspersing them
Hmm.
between the poems. And also to have one haiku on a page. Haiku are typically kind of, there's two or three or four on a page, which I find it's distracting. Your eye is kind of going on to the next one all the time. So I made that decision. And then in terms of the shorter poems and the longer poems, I I just put them together in such a way that the poems that were side by side would seem to fit or wouldn't be jarring to move from one to the other. Um, so that's the kind of general principle that I used. It so happens that the longer poems are kind of grouped together at the end of the first section and the beginning of the second section. That's where the longer poems happen to occur. So they're right before and right after the haiku. And that was a deliberate decision. I'm not sure why that felt right to me to have the longer poems abutting the really short ones, the haiku, but that felt right. And then, yeah, beyond that, just kind of seeing on the local level, you know, which three or four poems, create a kind of sequence,
Hmm.
uh, or speak to each other in some way, or there's some connecting thread that might even not be fully apparent at first, but when you read it again, you see that, oh yes, there's this connecting thread that runs through these two or three or four poems. So yeah, I feel like that's really important. And in a book this short, you can do that. I mean, it's easier to do that than a book that's 200 pages, maybe. And I'm an advocate for minimalism. I think there is this quality of too muchness in our culture, and this idea that bigger is better, that if something small is good, then enlarging it will make it even better. And I think it's often not the case, that there's something to be said for smallness, for a kind of reserve or modesty, for example.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I would, poets who are listening, you know, write a short book. I mean, it's easier. Make it easier on yourself.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really appreciate what you're saying about this. Again, it's a way in which poetry and this type of poetry in particular is pushing back against the culture at large and saying, okay, yeah, bigger isn't better. Let's be attentive to the smallest pieces of our
Yeah,
experience um, and maybe leave it at that instead of, as you said, trying to um, expound on, accumulate,
yeah.
all
Say
those
everything
all those
about everything.
those gestures. So they all show up in poetry too, right?
Yeah, yeah. And which is not, I mean, I love Kevin Young, for example. I mean, I love his work and I love his books, but it's just there is a it doesn't it seem to you like poetry books have gotten longer?
Well, I have noticed, and because this comes up a lot in workshops when I
Yeah.
teach, inevitably I'll get the question from a poet who's brought in a piece of work that's smaller, right? On the page looks visually like less.
Mhm.
When the majority of students are bringing in long
Yeah, yeah,
narrative, multi-page,
yeah.
complicated pieces that I thoroughly enjoyed. I am not, playing favorites
Right.
in any way, but the poet with the smaller piece will ask the question, is this enough? You
Yeah.
know, is this
Mhm.
enough? And I get that question over and over again. Is this enough? And I've
Yeah.
asked it of my own work at times because
Yeah. Mhm.
like you, I maybe have a predisposition to uh, concision or
Yeah.
brevity, the
Yeah.
short line,
Yeah.
less being more.
Yeah.
Um, and so I've had to sort of fight a little bit to reassure
Yeah. Yeah.
students because when you
Yeah.
look in journals, you do see
Yeah.
a lot of very long lines and very
Yeah.
lengthy poems. And
Yeah.
again,
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that. It's just, but I want to paint uh, I want to give them the set of tools that includes
Yeah.
brevity.
Yeah.
right? Let's
Yeah, because I mean, there are many experiences or observations or ideas that don't merit a long treatment. And but if you give yourself the freedom to write a short poem, then you're expanding your the possible range of subjects or experiences that can make it into poetry. I want to share another haiku with you. This is by John Wills. Keep outside, but the violets keep on going. Isn't that great?
That's great. I love it.
It says everything about humans and nature.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I'm a huge advocate for uh smallness in poetry. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But not to the exclusion of longer forms. And there's something wonderful about being able to stretch out, and really go deeply into an experience and look at it from different perspectives and say more and more and let the poem kind of carry you along. And that's wonderful. But the short poems offer a different kind of pleasure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well, maybe this is a good place for us to hear one more poem.
Yeah, absolutely. Would you like to hear? Well, I'll read this poem, Something and Nothing. It kind of speaks to that, although I want to read Dudley Ball too, which is a long poem.
Well, let's hear them both, a short one and a long one.
Okay, all right. Something and Nothing. And this is another poem in couplets, although the lines are a bit longer. Something and nothing. There's something to be said for having nothing to say, though I don't know what that is or isn't. Just as there's something to be known about not knowing, which I would tell you if I could. There must be something to be gained by losing, a seed of victory buried in every failure, else I would not be here. Clearly, there's something to be desired about being beyond desire, as the sages never tire of telling us. And nothing more fulfilling than emptying yourself out. No ground beneath your feet, nothing to hold on to, no handrail, no belief, only this bright, self-sustaining air and a falling that feels like floating. So that's a poem where I just have some fun playing, with the language and these concepts and stuff. And, I do that kind of poem appears in the book with some frequency. And this is a poem, a longer, more narrative poem. It was actually inspired by reading some of the work in Kevin Young's anthology, The Art of Losing, Poems of Grief and Healing, which is really wonderful. And so childhood experience, I don't often write about childhood experiences, but this is one that stayed with me. Dudley Ball. In third grade, only two kids got chased around the playground. One was a shaggy-haired boy, I think his name was Peter, who miraculously appeared in Lincoln, Nebraska from England in 1963, trailing clouds of Beatlemania. I watched in helpless amazement as the girls squealed and took off after him at every recess. Hard to imagine what they would have done had they caught him, held him down and kissed him, torn him limb from limb like the Maenads in Ovid. The other was Dudley Ball, whose yellowish face and bloodshot eyes I now know indicated jaundice and liver disease, but at the time signified only strangeness, laughable ugliness, untouchable difference from the rest of us. The other boys chased him, threw kickballs at him, thrilled they could zing a ball at a weird kid named Dudley Ball. Hey, Dudley, have a ball. Dudley Ball, what a dud. The red hair and freckles, puffy cheeks, and constant perspiration amplified his otherness. No one spoke to him. But why do I see his face so clearly now? The fear and loneliness in his eyes, the faces of all the others I've forgotten. I was outraged at the injustice of it, the cruelty of the schoolyard taunts. I told the teacher, but can't recall if she did anything about it. And then he stopped coming to school. A few months later, we learned he had died. I wish now I'd said a kind word to him, tried harder to protect him. I had my own strangenesses, though mine were mostly invisible. I wish I'd put my arm around his shoulder, asked him to eat his lunch with me. We could have watched together the screeching girls, their mad pursuit, and marveled at the vagaries of luck and circumstance that exalt some and cast down others, dealing out adoration and ridicule in unequal measure. We wouldn't have talked back that way back then, of course. More likely, we would have sat in awkward silence or talked about what we wanted to be when we grew up, or maybe compared our cowlicks. I remember now how alike ours were, a cresting ocean wave on the right side of our foreheads, as though we'd each been licked by the same thick-tongued cow, a calm old cow who saw all our fears and flaws and loved us just the same.
Mm. That one's hard to take. I have
Yeah,
to say, it makes me teary.
yeah, yeah. I published it in the Sun magazine, and I got more responses to that poem than anything I've published. And a lot of people said, "Yeah, I knew a kid like that. I wish I had helped him out."
Mm.
I mean, yeah, unfortunately, children can be so mean. But yeah, it's a heart-opening kind of poem, I hope. Yeah.
Mm. Oh.
Yeah.
Well, in closing, I hate to close because I feel like we could talk all day. But in
Yeah.
closing, where can people find you? Do you have a website? Um,
Yeah, I do have a website. Is there anybody who doesn't have a website? I
yeah,
don't mean
some.
writers.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, johnbrownpoet.com. And yeah, I have a lot of poems up there, and there's some interviews and videos and things. I'll put this up there, for example, once I have it. And yeah, there's upcoming readings and stuff like that. And yeah, and the books are around. You can find them at the usual places. And this new anthology is coming out in September, Poetry of Grief, Gratitude, and Reverence. So I'm really excited about that, and I'll be doing some readings for that. I'm not sure where yet, but yeah, I'm here and there.
Great.
Yeah,
Well, thank you, John. It's just such a pleasure to talk about this book, to talk about your work generally. And I want to encourage everyone to go get a copy of this, but also your other wonderful books, which have so much to offer us in terms of, not only the wisdom of the experience that you're, gifting us through these poems, but also in terms of the attentiveness to craft and the attentiveness to the poetry making, which I so enjoy in your poem.
mm. Oh, thank you so much, Radha. It's just a delight to be with you and to talk about poems with you. So thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.